Addiction has become a very popular topic, and people of faith can play an important role in addressing this plague. The media is filled with tragic stories of the opioid epidemic or of the accidental overdose death of a celebrity. Addiction is enslaving and killing our young people, devastating families, overstressing first responders and emergency room staff, and financially draining limited healthcare dollars. Addiction is a monster that needs to be understood and contained. Only when you know what it looks like and how it behaves will you have a chance of getting it into an appropriate cage. The purpose of this talk is to take a look into the eyes of this monster. Why does it have so much power? Why is it so hard to overcome? The American Society of Addiction Medicine's short definition of addiction states that addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. This is reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward and/or relief by substance use and other behaviors. Addiction is characterized by inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavior control, craving, diminished recognition of significant problems with one's behaviors and interpersonal relationships, and a dysfunctional emotional response. Like other chronic diseases, addiction often involves cycles of relapse and remission. Without treatment or engagement in recovery activities, addiction is progressive and can result in disability or premature death. So what does this mean? What is the disease of addiction? Addiction was classified as a disease in 1987. At that time, addiction described a specific group of individuals that were seeking help, and the medical community had some things of value to offer. This disease classification also gave a diagnostic code number to the disease for the purpose of medical billing. Unfortunately, addiction was not viewed in the same way we would view other chronic diseases like diabetes or congestive heart failure. The disease part of this condition was not well understood, and what is not understood is easily demonized. Much of the stigma and prejudice around addiction is still present today. If you were to take a survey today, what would you expect to hear as a response to the question as to what is the cause of addiction? Addiction is a lack of moral character would be one of the common responses. If we were honest, this would be a common belief. The addict is somehow an inferior human being and does not have the strength of character to say no to alcohol or drugs. This is seen in how an addict is treated when they present for a primary care office visit, a trip to the urgent care or the emergency department, or talked about by misinformed family members. On the other hand, an addict will often present as someone who lacks moral character. This is a reflection of the brain areas affected by an addiction and not a true image of their character. The disease of addiction is not a lack of moral character. Perhaps it is a lack of willpower. It does take a lot of willpower to overcome an addiction. So maybe it is just a lack of willpower that allows an addict to continue. Recent studies and brain evaluation with functional MRIs and PET scans show that this disease is a lot more than just a lack of willpower. Maybe it's a sign of acting out, open rebellion or defiance. Even if the addiction started as a form of defiance, is that truly the cause of what is currently going on at the present time? Perhaps it's a form of mental illness. Addiction is associated with a lot of irrational thinking. Is that mental illness? Is it a chemical imbalance or the result of an inherited mental illness? There's a lot of confusion surrounding the disease of addiction. Confusion that must be dispelled if we are to know what to do for our suffering child, parent, patient, or friend. Addiction is a disease of the reward pathway of the brain. A disease is classically defined as an abnormal condition that negatively affects the structure or function of part or all of an organism. It is a dysfunction of the body's homeostatic processes. The body needs to be in balance to function correctly. The organ of a disease in addiction is the brain, particularly the brain's reward pathway. Your brain is amazing. It consumes 20% of your body's daily calorie requirements, yet only weighs a little more than 2 pounds. Your brain is made up of more than 86 billion neurons. The brain does what it does through the movement and activity of chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. These chemicals are molecular keys that lock or unlock cell receptors that then cause a reaction in the neuron. These neurons, in turn, attach in a specific pattern to other neurons through their dendritic spines to form a network. The particular activation of this system will result in a thought, an emotion, or an action. If we accept the concept that addiction is a disease, it is important that the disease classification does not become an excuse to justify ongoing self-destructive behavior and attitudes or a way of avoiding personal responsibility. To use the addiction disease as an excuse would be very harmful to the addict and their caregivers. To use the disease diagnosis as an excuse could be fatal. We must understand what we are dealing with if we have any hope of effectively treating the disease of addiction. The problem with addiction is that it is locked up in the brain. How do we understand what we cannot see? What we see are the obnoxious symptoms of the disease, a presentation which often limits our ability to see the disease. Medical science has taught us a lot about addiction in recent years, with functional MRIs, tagged neurotransmitters, and PET scans. We now have a much better understanding of the brain pathology in addiction. It is now possible to understand this devastating disease in terms that we can understand. So how do we do this? The answer is memory. Addiction is a strong memory in the reward pathway of the brain. If we understand memory, how it forms, we will have a better understanding of addiction. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well, is reported in Psalms 139:14. If we take a little closer look at what's going on in this part of our brain that suffers from addiction, it is a good example of how we are fearfully and wonderfully made and what that actually looks like. The word fearfully in Hebrew is yareh, which means more amazing than we can possibly understand. We only need to look at the DNA in the neurons of our brain to get a picture of this degree of amazing and beyond our understanding. There are 6 feet of DNA in each neuron, and there are 86 billion neurons. If you were to take that DNA and stretch it out end to end, it would reach 97 million miles. So how far is 97 million miles? 97 million miles is from the Earth to the Moon 6 times and then to the Sun. Now that's a lot of DNA. Talk about being fearfully made. This is amazing and beyond our ability to fully understand. The Hebrew word for wonderfully is palah, which means to be marked out, to be separated, or to be distinct. If we look again at that 6-foot length of DNA in the neuron, 5.5 feet is the same in every individual human being. We share the majority of our DNA, and less than 6 inches of it accounts for our individuality. This 6 inches of DNA accounts for our skin color, hair color, eye color, fingerprints, and so on. It accounts for all the factors that make every individual on this planet unique. So we are both fearfully made and wonderfully made. The Hebrew word for knoweth is yada ma'od, which means to have a deep awareness, like a stick stirring a fire, that we are a part of a greater universe than that we ourselves did not make. We have a burning knowledge that's inside all of us. This knowledge is the deep awareness of the following things. We have a level of meaning and awareness that separates us from other creatures. We have a purpose beyond self-service. We have a sense of eternity, that there is more than just what we are presently experiencing. We all share a deep sense of emptiness that cannot be filled with material possessions or social connections. These things are just not enough. We have an awareness of contentment, but most often experience boredom or restlessness. This just might be what has been referred to as the God-shaped vacuum. So this fearfully and wonderfully made creature with a God-shaped vacuum gets addicted. What is going on? How do we gain an understanding of this disease of addiction? We can understand addiction better if we understand memory and how it is formed. To understand memory, we need to understand a concept called epigenetics. Genetics is the DNA that we inherit, accounting for our hair color, eye color, and so forth. Epigenetics is how individual segments of DNA get expressed in every cell. Every cell has the same DNA, but through epigenetics, cells perform different functions. Because of epigenetics, a muscle cell is different than a kidney cell. Epigenetics allows our nervous system to remain adaptable and learn new things. A memory is an epigenetic, structural change in the DNA in the neurons in your brain. Let's take a look at how this works, first in the formation of a memory, and then in the development of an addiction. This is a string of partially uncoiled DNA. A stimulus causes a release of powerful neurotransmitters that directly impact the DNA in the neurons in various ways that will eventually result in the formation of the memory. This is called triggered neuroplasticity. Triggered neuroplasticity is the ability of the neurons to change or adjust because of a stimuli. Without neuroplasticity, we would not be able to learn or develop new memories, or as we shall see, develop an addiction. The most common thing that happens to the DNA is called DNA methylation. DNA methylation leads to DNA exposure. This is similar to the effect a cancer-causing chemical has on a cell that results in becoming a cancer. DNA methylation prepares the cell to change its structure and its function. Also occurring is post-translational modification of histones that allows the tightly coiled DNA to uncoil and expose more areas of DNA that can then be modified. This tightly coiled bundle of DNA is now exposed. The cell structure and function continue to change through modifications of non-coding RNAs that remodel chromatin and facilitate or suppress gene expression. In other words, the cell changes. Protein manufacture can be turned on or turned off. The neuron has now changed both its structure and its function. And functional changes that result in a memory. Let's take a closer look at this process in the context of something we can all relate to, the development of different levels or types of memory. A minimal stimulus results in a short-term memory formation. These kind of memories are easily lost or extinguished. For example, do you remember last Wednesday? What do you remember about this day? It was not that long ago. Chances are that unless it was somehow a special day like your birthday, you do not remember much about that day. If the stimulus is increased, the memory will last longer. This is the effect seen when cramming for exams or with major historical events. such as, remembering what was going on at the time of the assassination of President Kennedy or the first moon landing. Do you remember this day? It happened 17 years ago. Do you remember where you were? Do you remember what you were doing that morning or what you had for breakfast? Stimulus even more, and now the memory will last longer. To the degree it may have a lasting, lifelong impression. You are changed by the event. You may even act differently or interpret the world differently because of this overwhelming stimulus-caused memory. Boston, April 15th, 2013. What about this day? We most likely share a different memory of this day. The yellow dot is where my wife and I were standing across the street from bomb number 2. I can remember a lot about that day. I can easily relive that moment, from what I had for breakfast to the sensation of the hot cup of hot chocolate in my left hand as we experienced the explosion across the street. I was changed by that overwhelming stimulus. I still choose to not go to fireworks shows. This is how different degrees of memories are formed and stored. The process is very similar with addiction, except the area of the brain being affected is the reward pathway of the limbic system, and the magnitude of the stimulus caused by drugs of addiction are more overwhelming than the stimuli that result in a memory. These are the major areas of structural and functional changes in the brain seen with addiction. The structural and functional changes in these areas of the brain have been confirmed with several medical studies. One study showed that the effects of cocaine on the brains of rats showed 17 DNA changes in 6 major areas of the brain. Another study on heroin addicts that had been confirmed to be in recovery for over 9 years showed that ongoing major functional MRI changes when exposed to stimuli still occurred. Another study where subjects were given a total daily dose of 50 milligrams of morphine for 30 days and then followed with monthly functional MRIs showed that the changes in brain function that occurred because of the morphine exposure did not improve 6 months after the completion of the study. Changes in these areas of the brain have a prolonged and dramatic effect. Chemicals that can cause an addiction have their impact in several different ways. By directly impacting the neuron, or by massive increase in the release of neurotransmitters and the reduction in the removal of these neurotransmitters. The end result is an overwhelming stimulus to the neuron. This causes a flood of dopamine in an area of the brain called the Nucleus accumbens. This sends messages to parts of the brain saying, "This is a good and necessary experience. This is something to be desired." This becomes a powerful memory of both desire and craving. The impact of the stimulus in the hippocampus is to enhance the memory of the reward experience. It reinforces the memory that this is something I do not want to forget. I should remember as much about this reward as possible, where I got it, who I got it from, the people I used it with, the room I used it in, and on and on. The impact on the amygdala is an emotional one. I now feel secure, confident, and at peace. I have never felt this complete in the past. The impact on the prefrontal cortex is to assign a high level of value to this experience. Nothing else compares to this experience. I am willing to pay whatever it may cost to maintain this feeling. Just like the different levels of stimuli causing different permanence of memory, so with activation of the reward system, there are different levels of formed desire. A low-level reward stimulus results in a preference. I like that puppy. I like puppies better than kittens. But I don't want to pay for that puppy or pay to take care of it for the next 17 years. I experience a preference. Preferences can easily be changed, especially if you have an issue with your preference or a better preference presents itself. Just wait until that puppy chews your favorite pair of shoes. Increase the stimulus in the reward pathway and you get a desire. A desire comes from a felt need for a sense of completeness. This is the zone of operation of the advertising industry. If I can link a desire of yours with a product that I sell, then the sale is easy. If I can sell you the fantasy that a new car will give you a sense of contentment or acceptance, the car is sold. Unfortunately, the fantasy quickly fades with the first scratch or the $1,000 oil change. The eventual awakening to the reality that the fantasy did not bring the contentment or sense of well-being it promised. But we keep searching. Increase the stimulus even more, and now you have an overwhelming stimulus that requires significant brain changes to accommodate, and you end up with an addiction. This takes you past minor preference and desire into a world of craving. Your brain is telling you that you might die if you do not get the substance that produced that stimulus. This is the disease of addiction, the structural and functional changes that occur in the brain that has been overstimulated by chemicals of addiction. So now we have a better understanding of the disease of addiction, but we still have a major problem. The problem is with the presentation of the disease, the often obnoxious behaviors and manipulations of the addict. In other words, our ability to see the disease is clouded by how it presents. The changes in the limbic system not only causes cravings, but also causes characteristic self-destructive behaviors. There is a problem with abstaining. You may hear from at this point, I want to quit, but I can't. There is a willingness to sacrifice family, friends, job, and finances just to get more of the drug. There is irrational thinking that presents in many ways. The thought and belief that the drug is not causing any harm. I can overcome this with ease. The belief that the addiction is not affecting anyone else but the addict themselves. The fanciful belief in some magical answers to life's problems. To get rich quick schemes. The irrational beliefs about the future. When the addiction takes hold, there is impairment in behavioral control, and the addict may do stupid or dangerous things to get the drug at great personal cost. Then there is the painful cry of cravings. This may be experienced as a pain greater than any previously experienced physical pain. Then this leads to increased drug seeking and increased drug use. There is a diminished recognition of problems with behaviors and relationships, with eventual loss of supportive family and friends. The pursuit of the drug is now life's only priority. Trust is lost. There is a loss of standard reward capacity. Now there is only one reward, and that comes from the drug. Reward from social interaction, creative activity, exercise, or even good food is gone. This complexity of symptoms is the major problem in dealing with addiction. The brain changes caused by the drug does not set the stage for a pleasant interaction or productive relationships. The addict has become his own worst enemy. The individual's presentation blinds the eyes and minds of their family, friends, and healthcare providers to the underlying disease. There is a conflict between love and trust. The addict expects you to trust and respect them when they cannot trust or respect themselves. They are hostile to the necessary boundaries that must be put in place to save their life. At this point, they are often very resistant to any change. In closing, this is the picture of addiction I would like to leave with you. This is a picture of the dueling realities of addiction. What you have here is a precious little life, like all of us, full of promise and potential. Sitting in a tub of water. If you pause and walk a little bit closer to the tub, you will find that an accident has happened, and there's something very smelly floating in that tub. One part of this picture wants to pull on you to nurture this little one. The other part makes you want to hold your nose and run as fast as you can. Ponder the reality of this picture. and do not throw the baby out with the foul-smelling bathwater. Engagement in a recovery program and living a life of recovery with a lot of hard work is highly successful. This is what the disease of addiction looks like. In the next talk, I will look at the necessary components of a successful recovery program. So what is the role of the church community? Firstly, we need to be aware of the problem and gain an understanding of what we are dealing with. We are talking about members of our community, church, and family. Programs need to be carefully developed with appropriate boundaries. This may be best accomplished with members of the community already running successful addiction programs. They will not mind sharing because the problem is much bigger than any one program can fully solve. As mentioned previously, get to know the programs already running in your community. How can you help them? How can their expertise help you develop a program? Find out what areas of treatment or support are lacking in your community. You will need to know where to send someone who needs residential care or admission for detox. There's a great need for programs for families, especially families of those struggling with addiction or who have members who have suffered an overdose. Think of ways to encourage pro-social behaviors and growth for the members of your faith community that continue to struggle with addiction. For further information and references, please contact the Fractured Resilience website. Thank you.